The fuck going on with y'all, man, and welcome to the best endgame sorcerer build for Diablo 4, Ice Shards. This is my level 80 sorcerer clearing the first area in the Ruins of Eridu dungeon, which is how I leveled from 50 to 80 in only a few days. This build is mobile, deadly at range, has high burst damage, and is pretty decent against both single targets and large packs of mobs. The only problem you might experience playing this build is that it can be mana hungry at some times, but luckily there are a few ways that we can fix that. In this guide we'll be talking about the following: the skills and enchantments used for this build, the gear, what stats to look for, and the legendary aspects to imprint, the Paragon board and what glyphs to use, a progression checklist to give you some guidance, and a few tips and tricks to help with your endgame Diablo 4 experience. And with that being said, let's go ahead and get started with the guide. Before we talk about the skills, the first thing I want to say is that for every endgame build that I'll be doing for each class, there will normally be two different builds. The first one is used fresh off of getting level 50 and unlocking World Tier 3. You have no sacred gear, you have no ancestral gear, and you probably have no resource generation. So I would highly recommend using this first one off rip. Now I ain't gonna talk about each and every single skill point or passive or whatever, but I will go over our main skills and how/why we use them. Ice Shards is our core skill. It deals very high single target damage, and combined with the enchantment and aspect we get later, it can also do decent AoE. Inferno is used exclusively to vacuum mobs. Let me explain. When killing stuff, try to gather them all up and place an Inferno in the right spot to suck all the mobs in one place, making it super easy to land your other spells. Frost Nova is an AoE freeze that also applies vulnerable. Super strong. This skill, along with the Ice Shard enchantment, has really good synergy. Teleport is an extremely useful mobility skill. It has long range, makes us unstoppable, and gives us damage reduction. I normally use this ability to either initiate on a target for good positioning or to get out of a tight spot. Ice Armor is our main defensive skill. It gives us a big barrier, and there are plenty of benefits of having a barrier with this build, which we'll go over later. Flame Shield is our other defensive barrier. However, it doesn't give nearly as much barrier as Ice Armor, but it does make us unstoppable, making it pretty useful on its own. Avalanche is the key passive we choose to help us cast more Ice Shards and deal more damage. And because enemies should always be vulnerable, this should proc quite frequently. Now, when you stack enough mana cost reduction, resource generation, and lucky hit chance, then it's time to swap to the second build. We use most of the same skills and passives, and the playstyle is pretty much the same as well. However, there are a couple very important differences I want to point out. The first one is changing from Greater Ice Shards to Destructive Ice Shards, giving us another option to apply Vulnerable. Next is making sure we get 3 points into Devouring Blaze. With the Firebolt enchantment, all our skills burn enemies. Combined with the crowd control from Frost Nova, this passive lets us hit like an absolute truck. Next is 3 points into Hoarfrost, increasing our damage even more. And most importantly, our new key passive that we take is Shatter. Every time you kill stuff, they will most likely be frozen, making Shatter very useful. As far as the enchantments go, there are 3 of them we're mainly looking for. For both builds, you're obviously going to turn on the Ice Shard enchantment, because that is our core skill. For build number 1, we'll be using the Fireball enchantment to help us with AoE. And for build number 2, we switch from the Fireball enchantment to the Firebolt enchantment to always apply burning. And that pretty much covers it for the skills. So now let's talk about the gear. With each piece of gear, I will show 3 main stats that you want to look for and the legendary aspect best suited for that piece. Here we go. For our main weapon, we want to use wands because they give lucky hit chance. On our wands, we're mainly looking for critical strike damage, vulnerable damage, and core skill damage. And the legendary aspect we want to imprint on them is Piercing Cold, which helps us deal with multiple enemies at once. This can be obtained by completing the Dead Man's Dredge dungeon in the Fractured Peaks region. For our offhand, we want to use focus because they give cooldown reduction. On our focus, we want more cooldown reduction, resource generation, and mana cost reduction. And the legendary aspect we want to imprint on them is Storm Swell, giving us increased damage to vulnerable enemies while we have a barrier, which is pretty much all the time. This can be obtained by doing the Onyx Hold dungeon in the Dry Steppes region. For sockets on our weapon, or offhand, we use Royal Emeralds for even more critical strike damage. Next, let's move on to the armor pieces. For our helm, we're looking for cooldown reduction, maximum mana, and lucky hit chance with barrier. The legendary aspect we use on helms is Frost Blitz, which gives us an additional charge on Frost Nova. Out of all the aspects in this build, this one was the most noticeable to progression, so I would recommend prioritizing this. Unfortunately, it can only be obtained by extracting it from a legendary piece of gear. Moving on to the chest piece, we're looking for damage reduction, total armor percentage, and maximum life. The aspect we want on our chest is Fortune, giving us more lucky hit chance. Again, like the last one, it can only be obtained by extracting it from another legendary piece of gear. For gloves, we want Ice Shard ranks, critical strike chance, and attack speed. The aspect we imprint on gloves is Conceited, which lets us deal even more damage. This one, just like the previous two, again, can only be obtained by extracting it from a legendary piece of gear. On pants, we want damage reduction, total armor percentage, and maximum life. The aspect to use on them is Disobedience, which lets us stack an insane amount of armor. You can get this aspect by completing the Halls of the Damned dungeon in the Kyrgyzstan region. And finally, for boots, we're looking for mana cost reduction, Frost Nova ranks, and movement speed, with the aspect Ghost Walkers giving us more movement speed and every time we become unstoppable. And because we have more than one way to do that, it's pretty useful. You can get this aspect by finishing the Broken Bulwark dungeon in the Skos Glen region. For sockets on armor, we simply use Royal Rubies for more life because at times this build can feel quite squishy. Last thing on our gear list is the jewelry. On amulets, we want cooldown reduction, mana cost reduction, Devouring Blaze ranks, and the Elementalist's aspect, which gives us a sizable amount of critical strike chance. You can obtain this aspect by completing the Pallid Delve dungeon in the Dry Steppes region. On rings, we're looking for critical strike damage, vulnerable damage, and resource generation. The aspect we want to use on them are Control and Prodigies. The Control aspect lets us deal more damage, and you can get this by doing the Sunken Library dungeon in the Kyrgyzstan region. The Prodigies aspect helps us with our mana problems and can be obtained by finishing the Witchwater dungeon in the Hawazar region. For sockets on jewelry, we want to use Royal Skulls for more armor to further help us with our survivability. And that concludes the gear portion of this guide. So now let's move on to the Paragon board. The Paragon board is arguably the strongest part of any build. Each node may seem small on its own, but over time these small nodes add up. Factor in a few rare nodes and some glyph sockets, and now we're reaching God tier. But before we can get there, let's begin with the starting board. For board number 1, we socket in the Destruction glyph, giving us more critical strike damage. The rare nodes we take are Elementalist and Elemental Balance for more damage, life, and a bit of intelligence. For board number 2, we use the Elemental Summoner board, socketing in the Imbiber glyph, giving us more damage while healthy and some increased potion healing. The rare nodes we take on this board are Swift Conjurer and Reservoir for more attack speed, mana, and life. For board number 3, we use the Burning Instinct board with the Glyph Socket Exploit, giving us more vulnerable damage. We get 4 rare nodes for this one, which are Smoldering Embers, Cinders, Kindling, and Safeguard. These nodes gives us a bunch of useful stats to help with our build. For board number 4, we use the Frigid Fate board and socket in Elementalist, increasing our damage even further. The rare nodes we take here are Weakness and Oppressive, giving us vulnerable damage, damage reduction, and a bit of intelligence. For our 5th and final board, we use the Ceaseless Conduit board, socketing in Flame Feeder, increasing our damage against burning enemies. We only take 1 rare node here though, Hunter Killer, increasing our damage to elites and a bit of movement speed after killing one. Once you have all your glyphs socketed and the requirements met for each additional bonus, here is the order in which I would recommend to level up the glyphs, from most impactful to least impactful. You want to focus on leveling each to 15 first because this will increase their range, which means they can become even stronger. And once they're all 15, then go ahead and max each one out to 21. But honestly, at this point, there will be very few things in the game that can even touch you. Alright, now that we've gone over the skills, the gear, and the Paragon boards used for this build, let's put it all together and start progressing our character. I have created a small, easy to use progression checklist to help you guide your character through the Diablo 4 endgame. Remember that this starts once your character is level 50 and has unlocked World Tier 3. The first thing you want to do is obtain all the aspects that you're going to use for this build, at least the ones obtainable through dungeons. This shouldn't take long at all. The reason why we want to do this first is because you want to have these aspects ready to imprint once you find some really good sacred and ancestral gear. The next thing that I recommend doing is getting Renown 5 in all regions as fast as possible. The 20 Paragon points are really hard to pass up and will make it a lot easier for all your characters to progress. The way that I did this was obtaining/completing all things in this order: waypoints, strongholds, altars, and dungeons. And if you still need a bit of renown, then go ahead and do some side quests in that area. I know it may seem like a lot, and it is, but trust me, it's 100% worth it. Once you've done the dirty work and now have Renown 5 in all regions, then try to get a full set of sacred gear if you haven't already. You want each piece to have at least 2 out of the 3 stats that was mentioned earlier, and if you end up finding such a piece, go ahead and upgrade it no more than 4 times and imprint the required aspect on it. Doing this will make your character stronger, which, in turn, will make leveling faster. If you aren't level 60 by this point, then that will be your next goal. The reason why is because ancestral gear can be worn at level 60, and we want to get to World Tier 4 as fast as possible. However, doing the capstone dungeon at 60 may be a bit challenging, but memorizing the boss mechanics and timing your defensive cooldowns will help tremendously. Now once you've unlocked World Tier 4, the obvious first thing you should do is to get a full set of ancestral gear. This time, if you find a piece with 2 out of 3 good stats, you're going to try enchanting it a couple times to get a 3rd stat. If you are successful at this, go ahead and fully upgrade it and give it your highest rolled aspect. Slowly but surely, you are now getting closer and closer to godly levels of damage and defense. Once you have your full set, focus on leveling up and filling out your Paragon boards. Then, once you have that going, start doing high tier nightmare sigils to quickly level up your glyphs. If you don't know what tier sigils to craft, just take your level and minus it by 50. Now, if you've completed all of this, then that means you have a full set of ancestral gear with good stats and aspects, and a filled out Paragon board with upgraded glyphs. At this point in the game, you are a literal god, and if you care about getting level 100 and killing Lilith, the actual final boss, then by all means go ahead and do so. Alright, to wrap up this guide, let's go over a few tips and tricks to help with your Diablo 4 experience. One tool you should definitely be using while playing Diablo 4 is the interactive map. This shows where literally everything is in the open world. Waypoints, dungeons, altars, everything. This is especially helpful when farming renown. I'll go ahead and link it down below in the description. Another thing that you should be doing is leveling up your potion when it's time to do so. It may not seem important, but as you progress further into harder content, you'll need all the survivability that you can get. This can be done at the Alchemist NPC, which can be found in all main towns. Another thing you could do at the Alchemist is craft elixirs. Make sure you are picking up any and all material you run into in the open world so you can keep making these. Whenever you're about to go into a leveling session, you want to make sure you have an elixir active for that extra 5% XP. One way that people level their character and farm loot is by doing hell tides. These randomly pop up in your map every now and then and are probably the fastest way to gear up your character. The reason why is because hell tides have random gear chests scattered throughout the area, and these chests give quite a bit of loot. However, there is a specific chest that gives the most/best loot, including Forgotten Souls, which are probably the most important material in the game. These chests are called mystery chests, and there are 2 of them per hell tide. Unfortunately, they are extremely hard to find, but luckily there is a website dedicated to tracking hell tides and mystery chests. I'll go ahead and link that in the description as well. Over time, you'll come across ancestral uniques and legendary gear with well-rolled aspects on them. Go ahead and keep those types of gear in your stash because you might want to use them later. However, most of the gear you will come across will be straight up bad. What you are going to do with this bad gear, most of the time, is sell it to the vendor. The reason why selling is more important than salvaging is mainly for enchanting. Once you get to God territory, you eventually want perfect stats on your gear, and that, my friend, is going to be very expensive. Yes, it can be done, but you gotta be rich. So yeah, most of the time, just sell the gear you don't want to use to the vendor. Now let's talk about combos. You can use your skills however which way you want. However, this is the combo that I generally use when fighting. First, gather mobs and place an inferno in a good spot to draw all those mobs in one spot. Activate both ice armor and flame shield to give you a nice barrier and make you unstoppable. Teleport, if you need to a good spot to be able to land a good frost nova on all the enemies. And then proceed to spam ice shards until everything is dead, which shouldn't take that long. And there we have it, y'all. The best Sorcerer endgame build for Diablo 4, Ice Shards. And hey, if you like this video and found any parts of it useful, then I'm super glad. I have now made an endgame guide for Rogue and Sorcerer, and I plan to continue to do so for all classes, with Necromancer being the next, along with many other Diablo 4 video ideas. So, if you're interested in anything Diablo 4, throw me a sub, won't you? Other than that, thank you so much for watching. I truly appreciate it. And remember to stay a while and listen. Peace out.